And I'm not sure I said it while I was muted or not, but I keep my intros really short now. Did you hear me say that? Okay. I'll let you all do the majority of the introduction there. Hi, welcome everyone. This is Ask a Master Gardener presented through Fix It Fair. We will get started here in just a little bit. And welcome watching live on Facebook. We see you and get started here in just a little bit. Appreciate everybody joining on a Saturday morning, especially when it's as gorgeous as it is out here in Portland. All right, well, it's a little bit after the hour, so I think just get the ball rolling here. My name is Wing. I'm one of the coordinators of the Fix It Fair, which is a community resource event for the city of Portland, Oregon. We're usually in person, but still deciding to not be in person. So we are bringing you some of the amazing resources we would normally have in person through online, through Fix It Fair at home, or wherever you happen to be right now. And today we have a very exciting session, Ask a Master Gardener, with our friends from Master Gardener program. Hi, everyone. Please feel free to take it from here.
Thank you, Wing. Hello, everyone. My name is Dennis Brown, and my co-panelists today are Claudia Groth, Eric Butler. Claudia, Eric, and I are Oregon State University Extension Service Master Gardener volunteers. The OSU Extension Service Master Gardener program educates Oregonians about the art and science of growing and caring for plants. Master gardeners are volunteer educators, neighbors, and on-the-ground researchers. We serve our community with solid training in science-based sustainable gardening and a love of lifelong learning. We are eager to answer your questions today. And if you have any questions about the Master Gardener program, be sure to ask. And just, I think each of us will now take a moment to just say a couple things about us so you know a little bit about our interest and background. My name again is Dennis Brown. I've been a Master Gardener in Oregon and elsewhere since 2010. My academic background is in horticulture and plant biology. And what's making me happy right now in the garden is that I'm getting ready to plant my spring garden. I turned over my cover crop yesterday, and I harvested the last of my kale and winter kale and winter chard and just got everything cleaned up and turned to my garden and turned over where the cover crop was. And now I'm ready to plant and start my spring crops.
Well, I will go ahead. My name is Claudia Groth. I've been a Oregon Master Gardener since 1989, as a matter of fact. My background is in plant and soil management and in plant science. I kind of specialize in disease and insect control, and I love slugs and snails. So if you have any questions about those, I'm interested in those. Unlike Dennis, I have not turned over my cover crop, although the rabbits have sheared it down for me, so it's pretty much ready to go now. Hey, Eric.
My name is Eric Butler. I'm the I've been a master gardener since 2015. Started out in Washington County, recently relocated to Clackamas County. It's why I'm not doing this. I'm a professional ecologist. I work for local watershed council. So I'm very interested in particularly kind of the ecological aspects of gardening. So gardening for wildlife, native plants, naturescaping, things like that. And although I do quite enjoy vegetable gardening myself right now. I've got a bunch of garden beds out back of where I'm living right now, and or hopefully we'll have some veggie starts coming up pretty soon that we'll be able to get out.
Well, Eric, I have a question. Just something you said made me think of it. I recently had a question about establishing a slope. The homeowner had just gotten a garden or piece of property, and it had something of a slope on it, not real bad, but a slope, and they were concerned about erosion. And I wondered what kind of a urban, some suggestions for, establishing a slope with maybe grasses or shrubs, or what's a good way to go with that?
I mean, really on a slope you can plant all kinds of things. So it's again kind of right plant, right place, right care. But I mean, if it's a very steep slope, it might be a good idea to kind of put in some sort of erosion measures first. So if it's things like straw wattles or silt fencing or something like that, I would put down some jute netting, something just kind of get the stabilization in place before you start planting, because it's a lot easier to do the physical part before you start putting in the plants. But if it's a relatively shallow slope, you can kind of treat it like any other site. One thing to know about it is that it's likely that there's going to be more water moving across it rather than water tending to sit in place. And so it's going to drain faster than it would if it was kind of flat ground.
It's a lot of stuff to think about. Dennis, what have you been doing?
Well, I was actually going to ask you a question.
Oh.
And it was also, I'd encourage people, if you have questions, post them in the Q&A, or we're also monitoring the chat, or at least I am, to pick up any questions you might put in there. But we'll kind of talk about general garden topics if, until we get a question. So Claudia, you mentioned something about rabbits eating things in your garden, eating your cover crops. Now, I've lived here for a while now, and I have never seen, and I've been coming up here I owned this house for a while before I moved in. So I've been coming up here for like 12, 15 years and never had seen a rabbit ever until last year.
Yes.
And so I've seen them in a couple places around town. I'm having the feeling there are more rabbits around than there used to be. And I don't know if you've noticed this, maybe you've always had rabbits, but there has never been a rabbit in our neighborhood. And I've caught one in my yard, seen one in my yard in the last year. And so I'm a little concerned about my crops. What strategies do you use to keep rabbits out of your garden, or do you use any? I mean, I have some ideas, but.
I think you're right. I think the rabbits are really, I've never had a trouble with them. This is in my community garden, so I've had that for like 5 or 6 years. Last year, first time. And I think they're getting under the fence. So that's a real important thing to do. But rabbits will go under a fence, so you've got to put it lower, dig out a little and get below the surface a little, because they'll just dig under it. So fencing, as far as I'm concerned, is the most important thing to do. Do you have other ideas?
That's what I was thinking, a fence, and I don't know how tall it needs to be, but I do know they dig under things, so you need to bury the bottom of the fencing. Like if you put a chicken wire fence or something in, you need to bury the bottom of it so that they can't, or make it more difficult for them to dig underneath it, as well as it being tall enough as well. So those are the things I know. So, but getting a dog.
Yeah. Yeah, but the thing is, the dog is inside at night, and that's when they're there.
Yeah, a lot of them, they come out early in the morning, or they come out late in the evening, just sunrise and sunset. A lot of animals are like deer, like that too, the crepuscular, they say. So they come out in the twilight hours. So,
and I know there are repellents, but from what I've read, they're not consistently effective. And many times they wash off, or they get used to it. The animals get used to that smell or whatever it is. So I'm thinking fencing.
Fencing, okay.
The nice thing about rabbits is if you can keep them away from your vegetable beds, it saves you the trouble of mowing your lawn.
Yeah. So they will eat the grass as well.
Mhm.
And they certainly ate the grass in my beds and cover crop. So
They also eat purple crocus.
no.
They eat the tops of some. Well, I'm blaming the rabbits. I have crocus planted along my sidewalk, and there's both yellow and purple. The purple ones all got mowed off. The yellow ones they didn't touch.
With my cover crop, since the rabbits have cut it pretty much down, I'm planning on just pulling the soil apart and putting my starts in. What do you do? You said, Dennis, you turned yours over. How did you do that?
Well, I had a cover crop that I planted last fall that was a mixture of Austrian pea and wheat. And so I planted that probably in October. I planted it fairly early, I think, last fall. And I cut it off with a hedge trimmers. It's not a big plot. The area that I had covered was just part of my garden at home. Maybe, I don't know, maybe 30 or 40 square feet, not a big area. And so I just cut that off with a hedge trimmer. You could have used a weed whacker as well if you have a bigger area. Cut that all off down to the ground. And then I took a spading fork and turned it over so that the green stuff is now on the bottom and the soil that was on the on the bottom is now on the top, and turn that over. And I did that. I'm not going to plant that area for probably a month or so, but you want to get your cover crop cut and turned under fairly early so it has time to decompose a little bit before you actually plant your next crop. So I got mine cut this week, and that's one strategy. I've used that pretty consistently, and it's worked really well. I also grow fava beans for cover crop as well. And I have a few places where I've used those this last fall, and I'll cut those off here in the next couple of weeks as well and turn them under where I'm going to be planting some stuff probably, I'd say the beginning of May, my summer crops and stuff. So I want to give it a good enough time so that they start to decompose, that green matter starts to decompose before I plant my next crop. So that's usually my strategy.
When did you put your fava beans in if you're going to leave them all the way till May?
You know, I find that I think the official Oregon state date for fava beans is like the 15th of October or something. But I personally have found that here in Portland, I plant them a little later. And I plant them like the 1st of November. I've even planted them as late as the 10th, although that's getting a little late. And they don't get very big. They get maybe 4 or 5 inches. I find that there's less cold damage in the winter if I plant them later, because the smaller plants are more resistant to the cold temperatures than the bigger plants. A lot of times the bigger plants, if they get a foot tall or so by the time winter hits, those will get frozen off and they'll get some dieback, but the shorter plants do better. And so I plant them in the 1st of November is my target date. And then some of them I leave in and I harvest the favas in late May, early June. But I don't let them all go, but I do like fava beans. So I just leave some of them in, some of them in to eat. So as a crop, and I get a really fairly early crop, and then I cut those back and I use those areas for, you know, late summer crop, or maybe some lettuce, or just save it until next later in the summer when I plant stuff for my fall and winter garden. So yeah.
Well, it looks like we do have a question. Let's see, I'm going to read it. I have sweet peas growing in the greenhouse that are about 5 inches tall now. I know it's time to plant sweet peas outside, but it's too early to put out my plants. Either of you grow sweet peas?
Nope.
No. It would be fine to put them out now. If many people put their sweet pea seeds in on President's Day, which is about 5 weeks ago now. So that seems early to me, and we did have that freeze afterwards, but I would definitely put the sweet peas out. And if it gets pretty cold, We may go down to the 30s. You could throw some cover over them. I'm a big fan of the floating row cover, and it just adds a few degrees. It's not like putting a frost blanket or a greenhouse over it, but this floating row cover, some people call it remay, it will add a couple of degrees. So if you think that it's going to go down into the below freezing, you might cover them, but other than that, they should be fine. They love a little bit of briskness. Have either of you put in your regular peas yet?
I have not, but I would have earlier, but I ran out of time after I turned my cover crop. My soil temperature, which is a good way to gauge when to plant things, is at about 50 degrees now. I have a fairly sandy soil with it, which I've amended with organic matter and stuff, but it's a sandy loam. And so it warms up pretty quickly. And I usually would get my peas in sometime around the 15th of March, or maybe even a little bit earlier. Peas and radishes can go in pretty early and do really well. So it's time. And if I get time before now and I do some traveling this week, I will leave on vacation for a few days. I will get the peas in this week and get them started. So yes, it's time. Peas can be planted when it's, let me just check here. I think it's down as low as 40. Yeah, they're really slow to germinate, and you kind of the trade-off is, do you really gain too much if you just wait a few days until the temperature gets up to 45 or 50, and then they really take off much faster. So you can plant them on President's Day, but they're probably not going to grow very fast. You'll maybe get a few extra days by getting them in when it's 40 degrees out. But
the other thing when you put them in so early, and as you say, they germinate so slowly, you're giving time for the slugs to find them, for the crows to find them, for some disease to find them, and waiting until that good soil temperature, I think, gets them started and gets them going, and doesn't leave them open for some of the pests that can come after them.
Exactly. So.
Yeah.
I found that letting them sprout a little bit before you plant them too, like not all the way to starts, but just kind of getting that little bit of a root coming out of them. You can just put in a little plastic bag of some warm water for a few days, and or before you plant them, they just take off that way. You get them just a little bit of a head start.
I do that for a number of plants, actually pre-sprouting. So.
And which ones do you do that for, Dennis?
Well, I'm doing it for chard this year. For one, I've done it for a few other things, but kale and things, but I do it for chard. It's somewhat slow to germinate if I just start it in little transplant pots. And so what I do is I can take it, as Eric said, you take a plastic bag, a Ziploc plastic bag, and I take a paper towel and I double it over and wet it. And then I put my seeds on top of that paper towel and fold it in half and slip it into the plastic bag. And then I have a real nice warm spot next to my hot air register on my fridge that comes on, and it keeps the temperature like 70 to 75 degrees for a few days, and they really take off, and they really germinate quickly and fairly uniformly. And then I take the ones that have sprouted, and just when they just have a little tiny bit of the sprout or the root showing, not the sprout, a little bit tiny bit, the first part of the root showing, then I transplant them into pots. So I know, that the seeds germinated, and they germinated very well. It's a great way. Pre-sprouting is a great way to, especially if you have older seed. If you have a seed packet that you've had around for a few years and you're not sure about how good the germination is, you can take it and slip the seeds into a damp, put them in a damp paper towel, slip it into a plastic bag, and see which ones germinate. And if you get 50% germination, then you just take those 50% and plant them into pots for transplanting. I've done that. I've got some lettuce seeds that were somewhat old, and I tried that with them, and it worked really well. So that's it. Thanks for bringing
seeds
that up.
Are so tiny, though. How could you tell they were even sprouting? They were so tiny. They're so tiny.
It's amazing how quickly they sprout.
Yeah.
48 hours, 48 to no more than 72 with lettuce seeds. It's like 24 hours, you know, a bunch of them are already sprouts showing little roots out. And by 48 hours, you've got, you know, the first part of the shoot coming out of some of them. They sprout really quickly. So you have to be attentive.
And how big do you let them get before you go from the pots to a bigger pot or to outside?
Well, I usually just do one. So if I pre-sprout, or even if I just grow from seed in a pot, I have little transplant pots. You can either buy those little 6-packs, or you can make pots yourself at home. I let them get about 2 to 3 inches tall. You know, maybe a couple of true leaves on them. Really good sized true leaves on them, maybe 3 or 4 true leaves on them, depending on the plant. So right now I've got lettuce going, I've got kale, I've got, what have I got? I just got my list of things here. Broccoli, I really like sprouting broccoli. Sprouting broccoli is a great crop to have. Lettuces, celtus, maybe you don't know celtus, it's in the lettuce family. It's in the lettuce family, and it's, you eat the stem. It looks like a lettuce plant that got really tall and like it's going to seed, but you eat the stem and it's sort of like a stringless celery. It has kind of a nutty, crispy, green, I don't know how to describe it. It's a distinct flavor, but you have to peel it because it has the same bitter component that lettuce has in the leaves. And if you eat the outer part of the stem, it's really bitter. But if you peel it, it's delicious. And so I cut it up and use it in salads. It's called celtus, C-E-L-T-U-C-E. You don't need very many of them. Now's the best time to plant it. It does really well in the early spring, and then doesn't do very well in the summer, doesn't like the heat. And then you can do it again in the fall, but the plants don't get as big. If you plant the plants in the spring, they'll get 18 inches to 2 feet tall, and you'll get a stem that's the base an inch or an inch and a half in diameter, and you know. So a couple plants do you fine, but it grows best.
I'm going to have to look into that. I'm not familiar with that. Eric, do you grow anything unusual?
And nothing that unusual for sure.
I pretty much stick with tomatoes and the usuals.
So, you know, one of the things that's fun to do is to talk about sort of, you know, low cost things that people can do to, you know, keep their, you know, gardening is a great way to save money in general, but there are other things you can do to save money while you're gardening. And so I think we came up with some ideas. Eric, I think we were talking about some of these things earlier. Maybe we can share some of those ideas with people as well.
Sure. One of my favorite low cost, in fact, free garden resources is arborist chips. And so there are all these companies that go around doing tree trimming. Sometimes they're just kind of pruning branches away from the power poles, or they're taking down trees that people don't want anymore. And the arborist companies have to pay lots of money to take all these chips and dispose of them in landfills. And so they're happy to give them away for free. I mean, there's a service you can even sign up for called Chip Drop, where they will deliver a whole load of arborist chips directly to your house. But if typically it shows up in pretty big quantities, maybe 1 or 2 cubic yards. So if you don't need nearly that much, you can just kind of wait for someone to show up in your neighborhood, be chipping a bunch of stuff. And if you ask, you just bring a wheelbarrow, they'd be happy to give you some. But arborist chips are great. They're useful for all kinds of things. You might hear about things like a lasagna gardening, where you kind of pile up a bunch of organic matter on top of a lawn you want to get rid of or something like that. They're perfect for that. I like them a lot better than things like bark dust or other sorts of low complexity mulches, because they're a lot more ecologically interesting. They provide a lot of food and shelter for wildlife.
Another thing you can use them for is pathways, because the water drains through really fast, and so it stays dry on the top. And many of us, like me, have you know, soggy yards in the winter, but you still have to go out and, you know, get the trash or whatever. And so those chips make a great pathway as well for that kind of thing.
Yeah, they kind of cover up the boggy ground in the winter, but they also keep a lot of moisture in the summer, so that when the plants are more water stressed, having that mulch layer really helps them a lot. I mean, one thing I really do a lot whenever I'm planting trees or shrubs is they build kind of a mulch collar around it. So it's sort of a donut shape, salvage mulch, maybe 2-3 inches tall and spreading out maybe a foot or two in either direction. You don't want it piled up against the stem. You want, but it just creates kind of a little bowl around it that helps capture some of the rainwater and keep that healthy.
Yeah, and last summer planting trees, we really needed a lot of that moisture.
So you mentioned a term when you were, maybe you could talk a little bit more, and I know Claudia knows about this too, but maybe talk a little bit more about lasagna gardening. And what do you use? What is that, and what do you use it for? What is lasagna? What is that all about?
I mean, essentially, it's a way of burying existing plants. So if you have, for instance, a lawn, or if you have a patch of weeds or something, you want those to go away and you want to get a really healthy, high productive bed out of it. You just pile up lots of organic matter on top of it, just kind of bury the site, and you can do up to 6 inches of wood chips. They used to put down a layer 2 or 3 of cardboard and newspaper, things like that underneath, but they don't recommend that as much anymore because it tends to cut off the soil respiration.
Oh.
And so these days they just recommend pile it high with wood chips and let time do its thing. And so
how long would you say that it takes for 6 inches of wood chips to, and then you would go planting it?
I mean, it kind of depends on what you're trying to get rid of. It something like just an ordinary grass lawn that will kill off the grass within 3 or 4 months. And so if you don't want to, after that, you can either kind of break off the chips and then till in the grass, or you can even just kind of leave it be and let the grass contribute to the mulch layer.
Do you need to do anything to the ground surface before you start layering stuff on? Do you till it at all, or do you just cover it? Is that the idea?
You just kind of cover it. I mean, you obviously want to kind of get rid of any sort of woody or perennial weeds, because things like bindweed or stuff like that will just pop straight up through it. But or things like just kind of lawn grass or annual weeds, dandelions, things like that, that'll just all kind of get starved out.
You know what I'd like to get starved out is those little woods hyacinths, the purple ones that seem to just take over.
Oh, grape hyacinths.
Grape hyacinth, yeah. And they're very persistent. And I've done that covering in some areas where I can. And then other times just pulling the tops off, as you say, starving out those roots. You have to be persistent, but I can tell I'm making progress.
It's funny you're talking about rabbits earlier. I've actually seen the rabbits eating those, which kind of surprised me.
Really?
Yeah.
Maybe I'll import some rabbits.
Yeah, so in my last yard, there are a bunch of dandelions, a bunch of grape hyacinths growing next to them. Or daffodils, excuse me. They're just ignoring the daffodils, but they're just mowing the grape hyacinths down. I don't think it's enough to kill them, but yeah, at least they're getting chomped.
Yeah. Let's see, we have another question. Mulching around hydrangeas. What do you recommend? Can you use those chips around hydrangeas?
Yeah, I mean, you can use just kind of general wood chips around most plants. There are a few things where you want to be kind of selective about what's in them. So for instance, for mulching blueberries, which is also kind of one of those exceptions to do the collar style, they actually like having their bases buried. But you want to avoid certain kinds of softwood chips. So things like, I think Western hemlock and Western red cedar and other things in sort of the cypress family are kind of problematic for those, but even like Douglas fir is fine. But yeah, for the most part, arborist chips are pretty versatile.
I think I've used more of the bark dust or compost around my perennials, but around the shrubs and trees, the chips are really great. Yeah.
And so you don't want to work the chips into the soil either. You want to just leave them as a surface layer. So if they go into the soil, the high carbon stuff breaks down, starts sucking nitrogen out of the soil. So it might end up having kind of unintended consequences. And can also change the pH and other properties of the soil you don't necessarily want to do. But just being on top, it's going to break down really slow and just kind of slowly add organic matter to the soil, and obviously have all the other benefits about keeping moisture in and suppressing weeds and all that.
Well, I have a suggestion for a little low cost do it yourself. For folks who have decks or terraces and don't have a lot of room to grow vegetables, you don't even need a pot. Here we have just a bag of soil, a regular old bag of soil, and I've just cut some holes in it and plopped my lettuce starts right into it. And that'll grow my lettuce just like that throughout the spring. And it's just easy to do. Buy the bag of soil. I do have it in a little tray so that it's easy to carry. But you don't even need a pot to do that. You know, put it on a step or put it on a railing even of a porch or a deck, and there you go. So that's an easy way to do it. You don't have to, in apartments or places where you don't have a lot of storage, you don't even need to have a pot. So that's my tip for the day.
We do have another question. I'll read it here. I have a salvia hot lips plant. It grew too big last summer, but now has no leaves. Can I prune it now, and how much can I prune off?
You can prune those pretty much down to the ground. They're going to come up from the roots, not from the top. So cutting them down, and it'll be right back to being too tall by the end of the summer.
Yeah, so they can take a pretty severe heading back, it sounds like.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Because they're going to sprout from the crown.
Okay.
Yeah, that sounds like one that needs to get rehomed to a bigger space.
They can take up a lot of room.
Yeah.
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 I do that with several of my perennials that, I have some penstemons in my backyard too, a red penstemon, and it stays green most of the winter, but it's kind of looking a little ratty by the end of the winter. And so in probably early March, I come in and I just cut it off of the ground, and then it all resprouts again from the ground, and it really responds well to that. A lot of your perennials, some of your perennials will do that really well.
Yeah, a lot of the salvias.
Anything in the mint family is going to be really vigorous like
Right.
that.
Yes.
Yeah. So when they look bad, you can go ahead and cut them back. With some of the grasses that have died over the winter or look like they've died, turned brown, this is a great time to cut them back, because if you look down, you'll see the new little sprouts coming, and you don't want them to get too big, because then you'll cut them off if you prune. So, getting out there and looking and cutting off your grasses or your ferns. Same thing with the ferns. You don't want to get the little new ferns coming up. You can cut off the old leaves.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And I actually just did that about 2 weeks ago. I went in and cut back some of my ferns that if you just let them grow, the leaves start to die back anyway, and it kind of keeps them under control, and all that new growth comes out. And my grasses, you mentioned grasses too. I have the forestier grasses, the forester grass, I forget what it's called, the sort of the grass that's the ubiquitous grass that you see everywhere, grows in a clump and puts up a straight stalk of a plume of grasses in the summertime. It's used quite frequent. I have along a fence, and I just sheared that back to the ground. And I even now, about a week and a half, 2 weeks later, it's starting to put up new green shoots. There's a little clump of green shoots now at the base. So
I always realize it if I've waited too long, because then you have to pull each individual old blade out.
Oh, good.
Don't wait too long.
Eric, you were going to say something too. I think you started when I was.
I know with a lot of the grasses that even shearing off the old growth stimulates more vigorous new growth in the spring too.
Yeah.
Oh, that's good to know. With some of the grasses that are evergreen, those I just kind of card my fingers through and get out any of the dead ones and that don't look so good. And then you leave the nice the ones that have survived, and then the new ones come out. So yeah, grasses are just such a great thing to have, and pretty easy to take care of. Timing is everything.
Mm-hmm.
I see there was a follow-up question about your salad in the bag. How do you harvest the lettuce?
Oh, for me, because it's the way I do it. Individual leaves, kind of as you would in your garden, taking off the leaves that get bigger and letting the rest of it continue to grow. Although in the past I have cut the whole thing off, leaving a little bit of the stem and taking the rest inside, and then that stem will regrow some more leaves. So you can do it either way. But with 6 little plants, pulling off a few leaves here and there on each plant, you can get a salad for yourself, and then let the rest of the plant keep going. Easy to do.
I see we have another question in the Q&A. Someone sees tomato plants for sale in the stores right now. If I bought one, what should I do with it? Claudia, that's sort of my reaction too. My garden area is too wet to plant right now. Too wet and probably too cool as well. When do you put yours in?
When do you put yours in, Dennis?
I don't usually put mine in until the 10th of May or so. No earlier than the 1st of May, and often the 10th of May or so. I start mine from seed in my garage on a heated pad on the 1st of April, and they're ready to transplant about the 10th of May or so. They're really small until about I don't know, April 20th or so. And then all of a sudden, like the last 2 weeks, they grow like incredibly. So, but if you bought one right now, boy, I keep it in as warm and sunny of a place as you can until, at least the end of April. There's some things you can put heat capture things, milk cartons and things around tomatoes and stuff to kind of help capture the heat around them if you plant earlier than that. But the issue is they're just not going to grow very well. And if you just wait a little longer, those plants will catch up. I mean, they'll exceed the ones that were planted earlier just because tomatoes really like the heat. If you
not just the heat in the air, but the heat in the soil.
Exactly. Yes, exactly. That's a very important point.
I've heard people use electric blankets even. I've heard people use electric blankets even just to set on low, just to kind of keep their sort of less heat tolerant or less cold tolerant plants warm through the winter. That's probably a little overkill though.
I don't know if they're rated for outdoor use, but
but if you want to grow one indoors, that is.
Yeah. So one thing you can do is if you buy a tomato plant early, maybe it's a variety you really want and you're not sure you're going to be able to find it, hold it in as warm and as sunny a place as you can until the right time to plant it. And if it gets a little leggy, that's okay. Tomato plants can actually be planted very deeply. You can plant, better way to say this is you can plant a lot of the stem below the soil line. So if you have a plant that you buy now and it gets too leggy before it's warm enough, the soil temperature gets at least 65 degrees, then you can plant it on its side, in fact. So let's say you have a plant that's maybe, I don't know, a foot tall. You can plant the top 8 inches of it below the ground, so just the top is sticking above the ground. And you can actually plant it on its side and carefully bend the top a little bit so that it's coming out of the soil. But you can make a little horizontal trench, plant the roots and most of the stem below the soil surface, and then sort of carefully tip the top of the plant up and then put soil around it, burying that most of the stem. And tomatoes are a plant that produces what are called adventitious roots. And where that stem is buried, it will produce roots. So many plants, we say, plant them at the same depth that they've been growing. With tomatoes, you don't have to do that. You can plant them deeper than they've been growing and they'll do just fine. So if you get a plant that you bought early and haven't been able to plant it, or you find that perfect variety that you've been searching for and it's just really leggy in the nursery, you can actually buy that plant and plant it on its side, and you'll get, your plant will be sturdier by doing that. You can plant, again, you can plant the majority of the stem below the surface, so just the top of the plant is sticking out of the ground, and the plant will realign itself and grow straight up, and it will produce roots from the stem that's buried beneath the ground. So that's one thing you can try, but it's too early to plant your tomatoes. No question.
I also love how the garden centers see a 60-degree day in February on the forecast, so they immediately rush out all their tomato starts. Some people just can't wait. I understand.
Yeah.
I've seen people take their tomato cages and cover them with plastic and put them over their tomato to kind of keep it warm, and then take the plastic off the tomato or off the cage, and then there your cage is already there. So there are ways to kind of, as you say, insulate that little tomato. But still, this is much too early.
Yeah, it's the soil temperature here that's the issue. The air temperature, we're supposed to get up to 70 almost next week. I think on Monday or Tuesday, it's supposed to be 70. I saw in the forecast. And but the soil temperature isn't going to be that warm, and the plants really react a lot to the soil temperature. If their roots are too cool, they're not going to be able to take up nutrients and things the way, then put out the growth the way they should, so that they can take up nutrients to support the top of the plant. So.
I think also, in many cases, certainly in my backyard, as I say, the soil is so wet. It's just so soggy, and digging around in that is so damaging to the soil, to be digging in that cold, wet soil. As you dig, you're compacting it a little bit more. So really waiting for that warmth for it to drain out a little is really going to be better in the long run for your soil as well as for your plants.
Yeah. And I should caution that I said I could plant at the beginning of May, maybe even April, but I have a fairly sandy soil at my yard. Most people in Portland do not have sandy soils. My impression is that from just talking to other people that it's mostly more heavy clay, like Claudia has been talking about, more clay. And clay soils are slower to warm up than sandy soils. I'm working on a project now where the soil at a garden where the soil is 92% sand. And I was out there 2 weeks ago and their soil was at 50 degrees already. And my soil in my yard was only at 40. And it's because sandy soils warm up much faster than clay soils because they hold less water. So the air spaces in the soil and the soil particles heat up much faster than water does. And if your soil is heavy clay that has lots of water in it, it's going to be slower to warm up than a sandy soil, which has mostly air in the pore spaces. So that might drive when you can plant things as well. If you have a sandy soil, you can probably plant a little earlier than if you have a clay soil that's heavy. So that's something to know as well.
Same thing is true for raised beds. Many of our raised beds drain faster, are warmer. I think a soil thermometer is a terrific tool to have for all your planting needs there.
It's also a really good idea always to do a soil test. Even if you just want to figure out what your soil is made of, you can do the mason jar test where you fill it with about 4 inches of soil, then fill it the rest of the way with water, give it a good hard shake. And then each portion of the soil will settle out at different rates. And so within about 30 seconds, it will figure out how much of that is sand. And then within a couple hours, you'll see how much of that is silt, and whatever is left and stays in suspension is the clay.
And that's a really simple, fast, 24 hours for all the clay to sort of settle out. But that's a great way to see, even in different parts of your yard, you may have different areas that have different amounts of clay in it as well. And that really that really helps how to treat your soil and how to react to it. Can I put it in a little bit sooner? Can I put it in? Do I need to wait a little bit later? So
I see we have another question in the Q&A. It's a question about spotted winged Drosophila fruit flies on berry crops. And this person notes that the past 2 years they've had very few and asks if they're becoming more absent in our area.
I have not heard they're becoming more absent for the growers, but I have had a number of homeowners tell me that they have fewer this year. They had less damage last year. And I wonder if it had to do with we had such an unusual last year. Really early we had warm, then it crashed to cold, then it was warm, and then we had the heat dome. And I wonder how much of that had to do with how they overwintered, whether there were not as many overwintered. But I would still, if I had blueberries, even strawberries, I would still be putting out my traps for the spotted winged Drosophila. They're easy to make with the cider vinegar and traps in your cold cups you get from your local coffee store. You can make them with that. And we do have some online. OSU does have some videos of how to make those spotted winged Drosophila traps. And that would give you a real good indication. Yeah. Well, I'm going to put in another tip here for a pest control, a lower cost tip for controlling my friends, the slugs and snails. You don't have to go out and buy, expensive traps. You can make them with just a little yogurt or cottage cheese container. Put your holes in there. And you can sink it partway into the ground, not all the way into the ground. You don't want the good guys to fall in by accident, but put it in the ground. Put a little bit of beer, any kind of beer in there. But the latest thing is cucumbers. Cucumbers are their favorite now. Something in there draws them. So you could put in some cucumber slices, put a cover on it so that the rain doesn't dilute it. And those little guys will go in there, and in the morning you can go out, dump them in your compost pile or a bucket of soapy water and get rid of them. But you can do with a few little things at home, you can make some pretty good slug and snail traps. If you're going after snails, make sure that the opening is big enough for those California brown snails that are the bane of our existence. So easy to do for a little slug trap.
The beer is out and cucumbers are in. I guess the slugs are on a health kick.
Yeah, they've been doing work down at Oregon State on what attracts, what components attract slugs and snails the most efficiently. And for many years, I used chopped up lettuce under boards, under pots. You can but it now appears that cucumbers are even more attractive than lettuce. So now, even if you just put a board out or a pot, put a couple slices of lettuce or a couple slices of cucumbers under there and kind of prop up your pot. They'll be in there and you can find them in the morning. So, and really prevention of problems is so much more effective, cost effective, work effective than waiting till after it is. So after you see the problem. So even just walking around in your garden and observing what's out there, you can see the first beginnings of an aphid attack, and then just take your hose and you before they get covering everything. So a little bit of observation and prevention can really keep that vegetable garden or your flower garden going.
I have a question about your slug and snail trap. How do you get such perfect little rectangular holes cut in the top of that container?
I worked very hard on that.
What's your technique?
I'm very careful, Dennis. I want all my 10 fingers left. So yeah, so but they wouldn't have to be that perfect. So what are some of the pest problems that you folks run into most?
Looks like we had one just pop in the chat. It says sawflies eating by gooseberries. Tried everything. I have been something to use some organism at a particular time. When is that? Nematodes? When?
I do not know offhand where sawflies overwinter. If they do overwinter in the ground, the nematodes might be helpful. They're helpful for the vine weevils, fleas that are in the soil. But I do not know. Do either of you know where the sawflies that attack gooseberries come from? Also, consider something like the floating row cover to put over I put them over the blueberries so the birds don't get them. So these could go over once they're pollinated, once your crop is pollinated. You can put a cover over it like this. It'll keep a number of things out, including birds. So you'd have to, if I had one of my books, I could look that up, but you'd have to investigate where are they.
Right, and I'm not familiar with the life cycle of the sawflies, and I think this is actually a good opportunity for us to promote our website. You could ask a question of the Master Gardeners, because as Claudia said, we don't have our books and things necessarily in front of us this morning, so we're hesitant to give advice if we're not sure of it. So the best thing to do if you have a question about that is to go to our website, and I believe it's osumastergardeners.org. Is that correct? We can put that in the chat, and there's a form on the website that you can use to submit questions to Master Gardeners. And let me just confirm that website address here.
Dennis, I will confirm it for you. My ability to type into the chat has just ended. The website is www.metromastergardeners.org.
Okay. So www.metromastergardeners.org. If you have a question, you can go to that website and submit an online form to get that question, and someone can research that and get back to you with the correct answer on that. But because I don't think any of us are quite familiar enough with the life cycle of the sawflies that are affecting. Also, we want to make sure that we have a positive identification of the pest too, that is in fact sawflies. So if you have a photograph of the damage or some other evidence of the damage and how it occurred, that would be good to know as well, so that we could confirm in fact that it was sawflies that were causing the damage, because the corrective measure or the management that you might like to take, the management steps that you might like to take are dependent upon what the pest is and what its life cycle is. So we need to first make sure we have a positive identification, and then provide advice on how to manage that pest. So I think the best thing here is to go to that website and submit a form.
I think it's a really great thing to point out, Dennis, because that life cycle is so important. We need to use the nematodes, which are a live creature that we put into the soil that hunts down other critters. That has to be those critters need to be put in the soil when the critter is in the soil and not when it's flying around. But also, they're also sensitive to temperature, soil temperature. And so it's critical that we put them down when they can survive in the soil. So timing and life cycle is really important.
It's also important because you had pointed out using row covers to cover the plant after it's been pollinated, which is great.
Right.
But if in fact the pest organism was there the previous year and its life cycle is that and it's pupated, because usually what happens if it's a fly, it'll pupate, those will fall to the ground and they'll overwinter, and then at some point they'll hatch. And if you cover that plant before those pupae hatch from the previous year, you'll have this really wonderful environment for them to grow inside of. So I think you want to check very carefully and consult somebody at the website and see if they can find some very specific advice to give you on how to manage those organisms, because timing is everything. Mm-hmm. Whether it's the nematodes or it's the covers or whatever, understanding the life cycle and understanding the timing of the management measures is really important.
Yeah, as Dennis said, this is another argument for crop rotation, because when those little guys drop and pupate in the soil, if you move your plants away and plant them somewhere else the next year, they come up out of the ground and they've got nothing to eat. So timing, cover rotation, all of that depends or is affected by the life cycle of that little critter. And that's why it's important for the correct identification and then understanding the life cycle. It's all very interesting. Oh, another question I see. Eric, you like the chips and the what do you have to say?
I would say it's very tempting to overdo it, but don't. The ideal organic matter concentration in just regular garden soil is about 5 to 6%. As you see people all the time just adding huge amounts of compost or even planting just kind of straight up potting mix into raised beds or things like that. That ends up creating a lot more problems than it does good. If some organic matter is good, that doesn't necessarily mean that more is better. If you have too much organic matter, then your soil tends to slump as the organic matter decomposes. You get a lot of nutrient loss. You get a lot of stuff leaching out into the water system. I've read a few papers recently. They've actually discovered that just urban vegetable gardens are a pretty major source of nutrient pollution because people are adding so much organic matter and so much fertilizer and things like that, because again, there's this idea that some is good, that means more must be better. And so most of that just goes to waste. It just goes straight through the soil and out into the water system. And then you get all this nitrogen and phosphorus and organic matter. They're just out in the water system, where it's not doing any good and causing more harm.
Right. You see a lot of water heading into the streets. And if that's all got fertilizer in it, that's no good. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's a real situation where you want to do a commercial soil test, figure out how much organic matter you have, and then figure out how much you need to add to get to your right target. And most of the commercial tests will give you a report that doesn't have the option to get a report where it doesn't just tell you what you have, it also gives you some guidelines for doing amendments and such to get your soil up to ideal conditions.
And those are great. And you don't even need to do them every year. I mean, once you see what you've got, you kind of have an idea, okay, I'm headed in the right direction, or I need a little more organic matter, a little less organic matter, a little less phosphorus, for example. So you don't really need to do them every year, but it's good to have one when you're first starting a garden. Do you do them, Dennis, a lot?
So yeah, let me just talk a little bit about what I do in my garden and some of the recommendations from OSU is, like Eric said, really 5 to 6% organic matter in your garden is adequate. A little higher than that, not too bad, but you don't want to get as many community gardens probably have 12 to 16% and probably don't need that much. or don't need that much organic matter in them. What type and how much was one of the questions that was asked here. And I like to use a number of different types of organic matters and that you can add. You could add manures. You can add leaf compost, composted leaves or vegetable matter. I like to use composted leaves, something that's not got a lot of nutrients, not too hot. I've done a soil test. I know that my nutrients are adequate for most things. It usually needs a little bit of nitrogen. Most soils do need a little bit of nitrogen during the growing season, but not, it's adequate for other things. So doing a soil test is important because the organic matter is a source of nutrients, as well as it helps increase the water holding capacity. So I like to use leaf mulch. It's not as hot. If you do use animal manures, make sure you know the source of that animal manure and that it's been well composted. You need to be a little careful about just taking some that somebody says, oh, this is some horse manure that I've got and it's been well composted and put this on your garden, it'll be really great. Well, horses are fed both alfalfa hay and grass hay. And grass hays can sometimes contain persistent pesticides that even after the horse has eaten it and it's been come out the other end and it's been composted, residues of that pesticide remain. And it's a broadleaf herbicide that's used on grass fields that are made for hay. And it's specific for grass. So if your horses are fed alfalfa hay, no problem. Or your animals, if they're fed grass, it's potentially a problem. So you want to know that either that compost, if it's come through a commercial provider who's tested it and made sure that it doesn't have pesticide residues, or you need to test it yourself. You can do a germination test. You can probably find more about that online, but by testing to see seeds. But so the type of compost, it can be leaf compost or it can be animal compost. The thing about animal compost, you want the manures to be well composted, so that they're not hot, too many nutrients. They may need, just the right amount. I don't put on more than a couple of inches a year in my garden. I do a little bit more on my home garden because it's very sandy and the organic matter just seems to disappear very quickly in my sandy soil for whatever reason. But I don't put very much on my community garden at all, which is a slightly heavier soil. So you kind of have to look at it. They're both a little on the high side. Well, the community garden is a little on the high side. My home garden is fine at the 5 to 6% range. My community garden tends to be a little higher because it's years of accumulated organic matter from the city gives us a unit of leaf compost every year, and we have to use it up. so it ends up somewhere in the garden, and it just accumulates over time. So leaf mulch is great. It's not as hot. Animal manures are great, but be attention to that they can be, especially bird manures can be hot, which means they have a lot of salts in them and too many nutrients as your source. And they may also, certain ones, especially horse and cattle manures, could possibly contain pesticides unless you get them from a a certified soil vendor. So do be aware of that.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the thing about community garden is really interesting because some of them have been carved out of a park situation. The one I'm in was carved out of a parking lot, so they depaved it. So there wasn't a lot of good stuff there in the first place. So it is really important to kind of get to know your soil, what's down there, and how to take care of it, how to treat it. What is it high in clay? Is it high in sand? Taking a little time to understand that is really an important part.
Yeah, you're a soils person, Claudia. This is right. This is your
right up my alley.
Yeah, and all soils are different. So you reckon, like Claudia said, we have sandy soils, we have clay soils, and things in between. And you have to get to know your soil a little bit. Sandy soils, you add compost and organic matter to help increase the water holding capacity. Clay soils, you add organic matter to help aggregate some of the smaller soil particles to open up the pore space because the pores are really tight. So you add the same thing for different reasons. So get to know your soil and
Yeah.
you'll have a better vegetable and fruit crop for it.
Right, which is why a soil test, as I say, when you're opening up a new garden or you just bought the house or whatever, is it gives you a good place to start. As Dennis said, I don't think it's necessary to do every year because you kind of know where you're going. But it's a good one to start with. But just observing your soil, how fast does the water go through it? How cold is it in the spring? Is it take a long time to warm up? Tells you little things like that.
What kinds of organisms do you see using? Is there a lot of earthworms, or do you have rodents burrowing in them, or do you have lots of weeds popping up, or is things not growing in it very well naturally? So even just observing the ecology of the soil can tell a lot of the story as well.
I think people many times want something to tell me exactly how much of something to put in it, but your plants tell the story. If they're doing well, it doesn't matter what's in the soil. It doesn't matter what that soil test said. And if they're doing poorly, why is that? Are there no earthworms? Is the soil kind of lifeless? Does it smell bad? Things like that. But yeah.
Well,
Observing.
we've come to about the end of our hour. And I don't think we have any more questions. So I think maybe we can just wrap up. I see that Marcia has again posted the website information. If you have additional questions or think of things after this ended, you can go to www.metromastergardeners.org and fill out the web form and submit a question, and one of the master gardeners will research that and get back to you.
Well, it's nice to see you too, out of the garden as well. So enjoy the rest of your day and enjoy your spring garden.
Thank you. You too, Claudia. Wing,
All
do you
right.
want to say something to wrap us up or take us out?
Thank you so much. That was great. I was taking notes myself. Always very cool.
And we didn't even touch on houseplants, and look at Wing's
I know.
houseplants there.
I'll help with the houseplant section or session next
Another
time. We'll make it 2 hours and
Right.
have different topics, indoor, outdoor.
Yeah.
And thank you all for joining us again. Gorgeous Saturday out there. Just really appreciate you spending the time with us. Thank you all. Bye for now.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.